The Gibson Girl. When you think of her, she walks through your mind in a long skirt, head held high, her hair perfectly coiffed into that classic style eponymous to her. She represented a new type of woman emerging as the turn of the 20th century approached. She was athletic, often depicted at the beach, hiking or on a bicycle, at the height of the 1890s bicycle craze. She was independent, rejecting her Gibson man counterparts and examining them under a microscope. And yet she was not quite the new woman, an image that was her rival at the time. The new woman was the suffragette, the avid fighter of women's liberation, controversial and brazen. While both images were gaining popularity and merged in places, it was the sweeter, feminine Gibson girl that became the symbol of an era. The clothes, the ideals, and even the hair had come before her, but through the illustrations of Charles Dana Gibson, she came to life for the very first time in 1890. She was an elegant ideal every girl wanted to embody and could. The simple skirts, the slimming blouses, almost masculine in style compared to previous years, replaced the complicated and often impractical fashions of the past. The Gibson girl depicted an emerging attitude among the middle to upper classes. Poorer women had always worked as well as kept a home, as midwives, laundresses, maids, and any other job they could find. But the higher classes had lived in a world of privileged monotony for the most part, and now they were ready for change. The athletic, free-thinking yet feminine Gibson girl was not created by Charles Dana Gibson's pen and ink. It was simply documented and stylized by him. In his words, "I'll tell you how I got what you have called the Gibson girl. I saw her on the streets, I saw her at the theatres, I saw her in the churches. I saw her everywhere and doing everything. I saw her idling on Fifth Avenue and at work behind the counters of the stores." Much like today, fashions will come around, and after a while a certain set of values is attributed to the wearer. The Gibson girl reflected the ideals of a new generation of women, but gave them familiar goals to strive for, without having to step into the uncharted territory of the new woman. In the illustrations, the Gibson girl is always dressed in perfectly fashionable attire for whatever she is doing. But she was still easily accessible to the masses. If you couldn't afford every latest fashion, she could be reduced to her silhouette and hairstyle, both of which could be handled by oneself, unlike the more complicated popular styles of the past that had marked out the rich from the poor. A simple blouse, a plain yet elegant skirt, the tight boots, the large hats, and of course the iconic hairstyle. She became the uniform of the late 19th century, and all the way up until the 20s when the flapper replaced her. Across the world, women adopted this look. When you think of the early 1900s, you think of these women, and yet the individuals who inspired them are often overlooked. Today I will explore the life of one of the many women who influenced Charles Dana Gibson, his wife, Irene Langhorne. Irene was the embodiment of what the Gibson girl was supposed to be, at least in her looks, but she is not, as some have supposed, the original inspiration behind this iconic image. Gibson had been drawing for various magazines since 1886, when he began providing articles and illustrations to Life magazine, which he would eventually become the editor and owner of. The first Gibson girl image appeared in 1890, a few years before Gibson met the Langhorne family. Two other women are thought of as the perfect Gibson girl: teenage model Evelyn Nesbit, whose side profile drawn by Gibson you've probably already seen, and Camille Clifford, a Belgian model and actress who posed for Gibson after winning a contest to find a woman who looked most like his drawings, and subsequently made a career off of it. Irene is ironically not as well remembered today, but in the 1890s she was a celebrity in her own right aside from the Gibson girl fame. She was the third child out of 11, 8 of whom survived, to be born to Chiswell Langhorne and his wife Nancy Witcher Keene. The Langhorne sisters were well known in their day as rich, beautiful Southern belles, but as children they grew up in poverty in a single-storey house with only 4 rooms where the entire family lived. Chiswell's family had owned a mill and farm before the Civil War, but after it he worked as a tobacco auctioneer among other things, and apparently was the originator of the fast-paced auctioneer way of speaking. In 1890, after years of fruitless hard work, the family were about to be homeless, and the story goes that on the very day they were packing up their house, an old friend of Chiswell's from the war gave him a contract to construct a railroad, and thus his fortune was made. That same year, 16-year-old Irene had become a local celebrity after her debut as a belle at White Sulphur Springs, a popular summer resort the Langhorne family had been going to annually since 1888. The tradition of Southern Belles and debutante balls has endured over the years, but it was at its height after the Civil War, and ended in a sense with Irene. After she and her sisters moved on from Virginia and the prejudices between North and South gradually faded, the belles' cultural importance went with it. In those days, belles were celebrities, icons of the South, evoking what many thought of as a better time before the war, the golden antebellum age. Becoming a reigning belle could completely change the course of a girl's life, and was all many dreamed of. Money wasn't the main obstacle to success. Far from it, the society of Richmond existed in a state of so-called genteel poverty. It was the strict etiquette and pressure that was the challenge. It was a highly romanticised and alluringly outdated world, with a gruelling daily schedule. While at a summer resort, a belle's day began with horse riding in the early hours of the morning, walking about and making plans for the dances later, which happened from midday and lasted into the afternoon in full evening wear, and then, after a brief interlude of other activities such as having one's photograph taken, the dances resumed again and lasted until 3 a.m. Eating, sleeping, and even a moment's rest proved challenging. It is a testament to Irene's natural beauty and charm that she thrived in this world. Some belles spent practically all their lives training for their debut, learning all they needed to know and aided by an entourage of hairdressers and maids, as well as the application of makeup, none of which Irene had. Soon, however, she was mentioned in the newspapers, and over the next few years men and women alike went to the Langhornes' beautiful newly bought house of Mirador. Chiswell Langhorne enjoyed entertaining, and Irene was quite the attraction. Her suitors tried their best to impress her with expensive gifts, and even started bribing her younger sisters Nancy and Phyllis with presents such as perfume, all to no avail. Irene wasn't the literary sort, and so her sisters often had to listen to the poetry a suitor had prepared for her instead. Nancy kept a score, and in the end Irene received over 60 proposals from all different directions. Southern beaux now had competition from wealthy northerners, who flocked down to places like White Sulphur Springs, bringing with them some modernity. This influx of new wealth was looked down upon by the old families of the South, but numerous marriages were made between the two sides in those years, blurring the lines of prejudice and slowly stripping away some of the outdated etiquette that ruled Southern courtship. The eldest Langhorne sister Lizzie disapproved of Irene's fame, and the athletic and wild spirits of her younger sisters too. Lizzie was more at home among the old Civil War widows of Richmond, perpetually in a state of morose nostalgia. Irene, however, was moving on, to conquer the North with her southern charm. Washington, D.C. may be America's official and political capital, but in the Gilded Age, the social capital was undoubtedly New York, where Mrs. Caroline Astor had reigned supreme for decades. She had a friend and sidekick of sorts, Ward McAllister, who was from the South himself, and was Gilded Age New York's biggest social arbiter. He and Mrs. Astor created the 400 after the end of the Civil War, brought new wealth from across the country and overseas into New York, causing a shift in importance from the old families of the city, one of which Mrs. Astor came from. The 400 was a list of people thought acceptable in society, and in 1893 Irene was fortunate enough to receive a letter from McAllister himself, inviting her to lead the Patriarch's Ball. McAllister had founded the Society of Patriarchs in 1872, and every winter social season the Patriarch's Balls were given at Delmonico's, where 25 patriarchs would invite 5 women and 4 men as guests. No Southern girl had received such an honour before, and Irene became famous, thereafter being received in the society of Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington. She travelled around the country with her parents, presiding over all kinds of events. She was even the Queen of Mardi Gras in New Orleans. She and her sisters became icons of fashion and beauty, and her fame helped boost her father's business. A year later, she met Charles Dana Gibson. Gibson was born in 1867 to an old Boston family of humble means. In 1886 he began working for Life magazine as an illustrator, and by 1894, the year he met Irene, he was among America's most popular artists, and had become the country's highest paid magazine employee when one year he received a salary of $100,000. Fans clamoured for his autograph, and the beauties of New York lined up to pose for him. In the summer of 1894, Irene went to a dinner held in her honour at Delmonico's, and that night she met Charles Dana Gibson. The following day she visited his studio and played the piano there, and so he sent her a drawing of a Gibson girl playing the piano. As this courtship continued, even Irene's critical father was won over by Gibson's charm, and her sisters liked him a great deal. He and Irene were well suited, as his ideals fitted in perfectly with those of Richmond society, where money didn't necessarily equate with class or status. This was also a theme in much of Gibson's work prior to the invention of the Gibson Girl. Irene, standing at 5'8", with a figure that possessed both the sporty and voluptuous qualities that were popular at the time, perfectly represented the Gibson Girl, at least physically. A better match for the character of the Gibson Girl could be found in Irene's athletic and adventurous younger sisters, but she was a charming woman nonetheless, smoothly adjusting to her sudden popularity, even if she was more sensitive than her sisters. Gibson girls always had a certain look of superiority about them, but they were still occupied with love and marriage. Irene had turned down numerous wealthy suitors, many who were wealthier than Dana Gibson, much to her father's chagrin, but she had been brought up in a world of romantic ideals, which he shared, and they were a love match. They married in Richmond in November 1895, and the local newspapers called it a marriage of beauty and genius. Soon they were off around Europe on a lavish honeymoon, before settling in London. 2 years later the couple welcomed a daughter, Irene Langhorne Gibson, in 1897, followed by a son, Langhorne Gibson, in 1899. They weren't very creative when naming their children. Irene had smoothly stepped from Southern Belle to the ultimate Gibson girl, and paved the way for her sisters by being the first of them to conquer society, leave the South, and become established in England. Although her relationship with her siblings occasionally involved conflicts, whether it be for her political views or her favoured position with her parents or her husband's artistic career, they had a close and loving relationship with each other and supported one another when it counted. Her brother Chiswell bought her a house in New York, and Nancy helped her financially after Dana Gibson lost money in the Wall Street crash of 1907. Her younger sisters went on to lead equally fascinating lives, often following in her footsteps, especially Nancy, who would marry into the Astor family and later become the first woman to be elected in UK Parliament. In London, Irene was presented at Buckingham Palace, and soon gained close friends and admirers among the aristocracy. Dana Gibson drew it all, of course, and made a booklet of his London illustrations. When Irene's sisters came to England, she introduced them to all her connections, giving them the advantage in English society. At that time, Americans were in vogue, so to speak, with the wealth of Britain. It was the age of the dollar princess, an influx of rich heiresses such as Consuelo Vanderbilt and Jenny Jerome, who married into the aristocracy. They gained a title and became part of illustrious noble houses, which meant everything to the nouveau riche of the Gilded Age, and their husbands acquired some much-needed wealth to put behind the name. In the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt, her husband, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, made it plain to her almost immediately after their marriage that he had only wed her because Blenheim Palace was in sore need of repair, and her dowry of $2.5 million, which in today's money would be roughly $81 million, was just the ticket. Irene continued to be a leading figure in the society of New York and elsewhere throughout her life. In 1902, Dana Gibson had commissioned his architect friend Stanford White to build a house for him on East 73rd Street, New York. 2 years later, the 5-story building was complete, with a mixture of English and American styles, in red brick and white limestone. In the early 1900s, Dana Gibson travelled quite extensively throughout Europe to study art, accompanied by Irene, and they eventually returned to New York due to the financial crisis in 1907. They briefly leased their 73rd Street home while they recovered their finances, and in the 20s the house even had the Prime Minister of France as a guest. Irene held Gibson Girl and Return of the Belle parties, often to raise money for various causes she was passionate about. She was a familiar sight in the ballrooms of New York, at events and coming-out balls. She became increasingly active in all types of charity work, founding the New York branch of the Southern Women's Educational Alliance, and was the chairwoman for the Children's Planning and Adoption Committee for 25 years. She and a few other wealthy friends founded the Protestant Big Sisters, a charity to help the vulnerable and wayward young girls of New York. Irene held important positions in numerous other charities, and was also politically active, campaigning for women's rights as the suffragette movement gained popularity, and was chairwoman for the New York Democratic Committee that supported Woodrow Wilson in his 1912 election. She took up a similar role for his second run in 1916. As she entered middle age, she became more vain, paying extra attention to the upkeep of her looks now that youth had faded, but she remained a striking woman and was admired by many. In 1918, Dana Gibson became the editor of Life magazine, and 2 years later he bought it. The Gibson Girl image drastically declined after World War I, and in a few short years had been entirely replaced by the flapper. The Gibson Girl, like the Belle, was now just another pretty piece of nostalgia. Irene and her husband spent more and more time at a beautiful estate in Islesborough, Maine, known as 700 Acre Island, which had been built for them in the early 1900s. Gibson retired in 1937 to lead a quiet life there, having sold Life magazine in 1932. They shut up the New York house on 73rd Street as the Great Depression hit, but returned there together one final time in 1944, when Dana Gibson became ill and was taken to a hospital in New York. Soon, however, he was moved to the 73rd Street house, where he died of myocarditis on the 23rd of December 1944. A private funeral was held the next day on Christmas Eve, and the following year the house was sold. In 1951, Irene moved back to Virginia to live on a farm belonging to her son close to Mirador. She died on April 21st, 1956. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more. Comment any video ideas you'd like to see in the future. Until next time.